in a more basic world, it's fairly easy to separate routers from switches. Routers are going to filter and forward traffic based on layer 3 of the OSI 7-layer model, IP addresses, and switches use layer 2, MAC addresses. Well, the problem we're starting to run into, especially if you've been keeping up on an episode-by-episode basis, is that we're beginning to discover that the whole idea between what switches can do and what routers can do begins to be a little bit fuzzy. So one of the things that we need to begin to appreciate is that we have to be able to go in and configure switches. Now, the challenge here is that if you've been watching previous episodes, you can appreciate that for the most part, somehow you know a magic IP address and you plug in, you type that IP address into your web browser and you get some kind of magic configuration screen. And generally that's true. However, for the Network Plus, we need to look at some other alternatives. And probably the best place to start would be with this old Cisco switch right here. Now, if you take a look at the front of the Cisco switch, it's not too terribly exciting. We got 24 Ethernet ports. However, if you take a look at the back, I want you to see that right there. This is a console port. Console ports allow you to access, really not just switches, you can even do this with Cisco routers. You can access these devices without even knowing an IP address or anything else like that. Now, in order to make this happen, you need to have one of these very famous rollover cables, and this cable plugs into the console port. Well, here, let me show you the ends. So I've got a regular old school DB9 serial here on the left, and on the right, at first glance, you'd look at that and go, oh, that's an RJ45. Well, it does look like an RJ45, but it's got a very unique proprietary wiring, so it's not an Ethernet. It is nothing more, it's really a serial connection. So what I want to do is let's go ahead and get this up and running. Now, to make this work, you plug one end into your console port, and then you plug this end into your serial port. Well, guess what? I don't have a serial port on my laptop, but I've got one of these handy dandy adapters. Now, the downside to running things this way is that, and you'll use something like putty, fire putty up, and you'll get the connection. The downside to running things this way is that the serial connection is incredibly slow. It runs at 9600 baud, so it's really slow. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and connect via, you ready? Ethernet. Most of these switches have some feature that allow you to connect in using Telnet over your Ethernet connection. So I'm going to use putty, and I'm going to actually use Telnet, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. The nice part is the interface is absolutely identical to the one you'd see by running through the rollover port, but it'll be fast enough that we won't fall asleep during the presentation. So give me a second. I'm going to plug this in, and let's take a look at the most raw type of interface you can see. And actually, it has an operating system called iOS. Let's take a look. Okay, so here I am. I've got putty up and running. Now, one of the things I love about putty is that you can use it for just about any connection. If I wanted to use my rollover, I can just go ahead and set it to serial. I would set the COM port on my particular system. It's COM3, and I set the baud rate to 9600, which is the default for Cisco stuff. And if I had it plugged in, we would just hit open and off we'd go. But I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to use Telnet. I typed in the IP address for my device, and I just hit open. Let me type in a password. Ta-da! You are in Cisco's iOS interface. iOS is a very, very powerful operating system that pretty much all Cisco switches and routers run on. Now, I don't want to turn this into an iOS course, but there are a few commands. For example, I want to go into enable mode, which is really where all the fun begins. And you can see that I have the name of the switch plus the pound sign, which tells me I'm in the enable mode, and I can do all kinds of stuff like show. So what I just did there is I said, show me the startup file for my particular system. And I can go through and see everything what is currently set for the startup. Right now there's not much in there because it's pretty much almost exclusively set up from the factory, but it's all there. So there's clearly more than just plugging in and getting to a web browser to figure out how to configure something. So we've used a rollover cable. We actually even use Telnet, which you can do for a lot of devices. Now, what I want to do is go back to the idea of running using a web interface. Now, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug, and I want to plug into this Netgear. So I'm just going to plug into any connection I want. It doesn't really matter too much which one I use. And The reason I like this Netgear box so much is because it has a lot of extra features that you'll see in switches. Certainly it has VLAN, but there's a few other things in there that we're going to see with advanced types of switches that is really kind of handy. So let's jump back in one more time. I'm going to fire up my web browser and let me connect to this little switch, and we can just poke around just a couple more things I'd like to show you. All right, now what I want to do here is just get into this little switch. Now remember, this is not a router, it's just a switch, okay? So everything we're looking at is going to be a very switchy type thing. So first of all, we'll fire it up and we'll see, here's his IP address, this is the factory default, and there's somewhere in there we can make some changes. So let's take a look. So we can do just the basic setup, and if we want to give it a name, if we want to give it IP addresses, you can see right now it's designed to get IP addresses from a DHCP server, but if I wanted to, and this is something that's really common, I don't want to have to guess what my switch's IP address is, so I can assign it an IP address that is part of my network, and I could go ahead and give it a subnet mask and gateway is all, but I could give it this, and then I'll document that, so it'll always have this. Anytime I need to configure my switch, I can go up to any web browser and type that in, and life's good. So let's take a look at some of the other things we have in here. We can actually set up access list we can set up a very basic access control list to determine who we can get in here, that type of thing. We have port configuration. In terms of port configuration, on switches there's usually not a ton you can do. But for example, we can force a speed, and we can also force what's known as flow control. There's not a good reason to do that I'm aware of. Another one I want to show you here is quality of service. QoS is actually a pretty interesting tool, and we can set up priorities for different types of traffic, and these priorities go from 0 to 7 on this particular router, and we can apply this type of priorities to, say, I don't know, FTP traffic, and we can actually throttle a percentage of our total bandwidth for things like that. Here's VLAN, and it's got a very simplistic VLAN compared to, if you've been watching in earlier episodes, the kind of cool stuff that we'd see with Cisco. But I set up a VLAN 2, I just called it wireless, and I set aside a few ports for it. Now monitoring is actually kind of interesting, because when we talk about monitoring, keep in mind that by definition, a switch does not allow traffic to go out on all of the different ports. So what we do instead is we can actually do something called port mirroring, but in this case it's just called a sniffer port. So I'm going to turn it on, and I'm going to say the sniffer mode is I want to see everything that's being sent and received, and I can set a particular port. In this case I'm going to say port number 1 is going to be the port you listen in on, and then I can sit here and say anything happening on any of these ports, I want you to mirror it to this guy. So this is a great way to use monitoring tools and that type of thing. Now here's some advanced things that are kind of interesting. First of all, there's spanning tree protocol, which is pretty common on better switches today, and you can either enable it or disable it. Mine's disabled for right now, and that's because I don't have a risk of creating bridge loops by wiring my switches wrong, so I keep it turned off in general. Now here's something called SNMP. SNMP, or Simple Network Management Protocol, is a tool that's used by all kinds of devices, but it's primarily used on switches and routers to have an idea of their status. So you can query them and things like this. And what we're doing here is we're just setting up an IP address and then what you can do for this particular device. So I can set an IP address of, so I'll set this address up, and then you can create a community. A community is just a name, and all of the devices that share this common name will be members of a community, and then you can say whether they're read-only and read-write, and then what they can actually do with it. SNMP, for the most part, is really just used for monitoring routers and switches and things like that from a single source. Just to make a quick mention of it, IGMP, and what that's used for is that if you're actually going to be doing multicast traffic, you want to make sure this is turned on. So if you've got somebody who's doing multicast, video conferencing or things like that, those are things that you want to have turned on. Next one is what we call port rate setting, where you can actually set how fast, or either as a percentage of the total bandwidth or in a raw value, as you see right here, how fast you can set a port. So for example, I can actually slow certain ports down in case there is a problem with them or I don't want somebody to eat up all my bandwidth. Now, all I'm trying to do with this episode is give you an idea of some of the things that you might be able to see within a more powerful managed switch. So keep in mind that even though it's not a router, it's not doing any of the hairier stuff that you're probably used to seeing, these little boxes can carry a lot of weight and do a lot of important features for you. So don't be afraid to go into your managed switch, poke around a little bit. Oh, and for crying out loud, change the default password or I'm going to hack you myself.